Hey guys, what's up? How are you doing? Hope you're well. Listen, this video is going to be quite different to my regular kind of content in one significant way. That being that this video is not made for, leftists like myself, but instead for those more right-leaning. That isn't to say that a leftist can't watch this and even enjoy it, but most of the stuff you will probably already be aware of and is nothing new to you. That being said, it might still be entertaining. So those of you that already know me from previous videos might know that I myself used to be pretty conservative in my beliefs. During this time of my life, I especially loved watching Ben Shapiro, which is also one of the many reasons why he was the first conservative figurehead that I ever debunked, one of my videos right after I created this channel and all that. Since that time, a lot has changed, of course, both for me as a person, obviously, but also the political discourse on both sides. So yeah, why am I making this video in the first place then, right? Well, I remember watching Ben Shapiro and admiring his intellect. This in turn then, of course, made me feel smarter because, after all, I had to be if I agreed with all these things that this obviously smart person that went to Harvard believed in. And I also believe that many that are more right-leaning feel this way to this day. Eventually, however, I started questioning all the people I once hailed as my heroes, aka Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and pretty much the entirety of anti-feminist YouTube that I was very, and I really mean very, involved with at the time. Thanks for that, Leafy. This questioning that I spoke of actually came in the form of fact-checking, as funny as that sounds. What I found was devastating to my worldview and would eventually be responsible for me changing the way I view media to this day. I started fact-checking almost every one of the people that I looked up to in the following weeks, and the realization I came to was rather disappointing. These people weren't nearly as smart and honest as I had thought up until then. Instead, they were incredibly good at using fancy-sounding words to then misrepresent a position to create a straw man that they could easily dismantle with what sounded like logic and reason to me for ages, for years even. The phrase, "facts don't care about your feeling," comes to mind as I'm writing this. On the surface, it sounds like a bulletproof response to those that want to make emotions part of an argument. But as soon as you just dig a little deeper under the surface, it shows how blatantly flawed it really is. The idea that rationality or logic are only possible as long as emotions aren't involved is only true to a degree. You should of course never bring your own emotions into a political discussion, but if you can consider the emotions of a third party that you yourself don't feel, is that still acting emotional? In my humble opinion, no. And it actually says more about your capacity to be logical if you can include an abstract concept like someone else's emotion as a variable in how you arrive at your conclusion. Even if you can't see or touch them, these emotions are just as real as you or me. To make sense of whatever the fuck I just said, I just thought I'd give you an example, to clear things up and all that, to be all teachy. We even have a case study here, you see, professional stuff. For example, gender dysphoria is, as pointed out by many on the right, a mental disorder that we can find in the DSM-5.
Playing, I usually say a boy who thinks he's a girl or a girl who thinks he's a boy, which is technically what we're talking about here. As far as the actual psychological issues at play, it used to be called gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder, now they call it gender dysphoria.
But then this fact is often given as a reason to justify an unwillingness to use the pronouns these people prefer to go by.
Okay, and I'm not denying your humanity if you are a transgender person. I am saying that you are not the sex to which you claim to be. You're still a human being, and you're a human being with an issue that I wish you Godspeed in dealing with in whatever way you see fit. But if you are going to dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are.
According to people like Peterson, this would be feeding into some form of delusion they claim is irrational to support. And yeah, this sounds reasonable on the surface, right? But you see, the problem isn't really with what is said here, rather with what is left out. This way of arguing fails to mention that the same book that lists gender dysphoria as a disorder also tells us that the best way to treat it is by receiving gender-affirming care. This can come in the form of hormone treatment, surgery, but also the recognition of their identity in the form of pronouns and the correct use of their names. The question then of course becomes, why is it important that we as a society do this for only 5% of the entire population? And good question. Let me answer that for you. In the US alone, 52% of just transgender and non-binary youth are suicidal, with 31% killing themselves before they ever reach 20. How fucked is that? But here's some good news in all this. Gender affirming care slashes this 52% by 78%. An incredibly high success rate in mental health in general. I think that the percentiles speak for themselves in so far that this is a very good way of combating loss of very young life. But to really drive this home, here's some numbers. About 5% of US citizens are either trans or non-binary. Now, 5% of 331.9 million gives us about 16,595,000. If we now cut this number by the 32% to simulate the average of successful suicides, we have a staggering 5,310,000 human lives that are lost. If we now take this number and slash it by 78% of the total deaths that we could have prevented with gender affirming care, we arrive at 4,142,000 people that could have been saved, a number more than double that of all COVID deaths in the US. Now, is it difficult to wrap your head around the reasons why someone would want this? Sure, to most people it is, but is it rational to then say that we shouldn't affirm them? I don't think so. Actually, I think it's incredibly irrational to claim that 4 million people should be at risk of killing themselves just because I personally don't understand what drives them to feel this way, and because I refuse to do something because feelings are involved. Humans are emotional creatures, and a slogan like "facts don't care about your feeling" only takes one of these feelings into account. That being a form of self-righteousness that you feel when Ben Shapiro destroys those you disagree with by artificially moving the conversation from suicide rates that can be decreased over to how someone was born a man and thus cannot be referred to as a woman.
Okay, and I'm not denying your humanity if you're a transgender person. I am saying that you are not the sex to which you claim to be. You're still a human being, and you're a human being with an issue that I wish you Godspeed in dealing with in whatever way you see fit. But if you are going to dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are.
So now you know why, as Ben Shapiro would put it, you should buy into their delusion. And I also hope that you now see that the emotions of others can not only be used in a rational argument, but also how the exclusion of these emotions does not necessarily make an argument rational. Now, if you don't care about people, as a whole and all that, then you may still disagree. But if you see that misgendering can and often does kill people, then I invite you to stay a little longer, because I got a little something for you. Just for you. Made it just for you. Yeah, you watching this. Click the like button, because I made it for you. Mwah.
You have to admire Hitler. That's the thing. Because he was an organizational genius.
In this next section, I want to demonstrate how these people often misrepresent evidence to fool you as a viewer to buy into the idea that they are arguing with rationality. First, we have a clip of Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro discussing gender roles.
I'm a personality psychologist, and so I know the gender difference literature. And it's a very solid literature. Well, first of all, it's very solid. It has a 30-year history. One psychologist got the personality models down, so that would be the Big Five model. All empirically derived, straight statistics, right? Brute force empiricism. Nobody had a theoretical axe to grind with the Big Five, except to say, maybe there are human traits, maybe they're encapsulated in language. We can use statistical techniques to find out what they are. That was it. That's the whole ideology. So very, very neutral as far as ideologies go. 5 traits emerge. Okay. Are there differences between the sexes? Turns out there are. All right. They're not massive, although if you sum them across all the traits, you can separate men and women with about 75% accuracy. So it's not trivial, but you have to sum across all the traits. Then another question comes up. Well, are those differences sociocultural or biological? Okay, we can test that. We'll go around the world we'll look at cultures, we'll rank order them in terms of the gender equality of their sociological policies. We can do that with broad agreement from the right and the left. Then the hypothesis would be, if gender differences decrease among more egalitarian societies, then the gender differences are sociocultural, or at least more sociocultural. That's exactly the opposite of what was found repeatedly. That's pseudoscience. It's like, no, that's mainstream psychology. Those papers have thousands of citations.
So this all sounds not only complicated, but also very reasonable at first glance. So why don't we together have a look at the study that is mentioned by Peterson here? But after combing my way through the video's description, I was disappointed to not only not find the study, but also no other source at that. This is unfortunately all too common with these people. I'll leave it up to you to decide how credible this makes them as intellectuals. To make up for Jordan's mistake, I then hopped on Google and typed "Gender Differences Study Worldwide Big 5" into the search bar. And sure enough, I found a study that, as pointed out by Peterson, was cited over 1,000 times. And wouldn't you know it, with the study I also found out why it wasn't linked or cited, if you want to be all professional and stuff. While the study did in fact find certain traits that women or men are more likely to have than the opposite sex, the conclusion completely disagrees with Jordan Peterson's assertion here.
Then the hypothesis would be, if gender differences decrease among more egalitarian societies, then the gender differences are sociocultural, or at least more sociocultural. That's exactly the opposite of what was found repeatedly. That's pseudoscience. It's like, no, that's mainstream psychology.
So why don't we read this little paragraph? Although the mean differences in personality between genders may be important in shaping human experience and human culture, they are probably not so large as to preclude effective communication between men and women. Unlike Bill Cosby, we are optimistic that any difficulties in communication between men and women are due primarily to cultural norms that are amenable to change, rather than differences in basic personality traits, which are much more difficult to change. As you can see, Jordan Peterson picks out the parts of the study that suit his narrative, but then not only fails to mention that the study's conclusion disagrees with him, but also completely turns it on its head, claiming that it proves that gender norms are natural rather than subject to cultural expectations. Is this the sort of thing a rational and critical thinker does? In my opinion, no.
I wouldn't apologize to you, soulless parasites, if I had a gun to my head.
Next up is Matt Walsh, and how he often manipulates your emotions and worldview by making empirically false claims in order to then trick you into agreeing with positions so extreme most people would rather die than be caught defending them otherwise. He recently uploaded a video where he covered the killing of a homeless man named Jordan Neely on a New York City subway, after an ex-Marine held him in a chokehold for several minutes.
In other words, Neely was yet another violent repeat criminal who had been essentially granted free rein over the subway system, where crime has skyrocketed over the last few years as commuters are frequently accosted, mugged, assaulted, even raped and killed. This is not just the case in the New York City subway system, but in the city as a whole and in major cities all across the country, as we know. But on the F train...
As you can see, Matt talks about the fact that crime is on the rise in New York City subways and how this goes hand in hand with crime rising in New York as a whole, as well as other major cities around the US. The problem with this fact is that it's never accompanied by any evidence to back it up. So why do you think that is? Well, to be blunt, it's because the evidence would actually contradict this idea. You see, crimes in most major cities are actually declining at a very rapid rate since the 80s, with crimes on New York City subways specifically having gone down by a massive, and I really mean massive, 19% this year alone. Now, considering that the evidence we have on hand regarding the subject would disagree with him, would a rational person still say that crime is on the rise? In my opinion, no. But we're not finished with Walsh yet. In the same video, he can be heard saying this.
This is an obligation that the left wants to impose on us. They want us to believe that it is our responsibility to helplessly submit ourselves to the whims of every violent scumbag we come across. But it is not so. And so this man took action. He deserves a medal for his actions. In a healthy society, that's what he would get. Yet we don't live in a healthy society. We live in a depraved and confused one, which means, tragically, I'm afraid, that his reward is likely to be quite different.
This, yet again, sounds fairly reasonable on the surface. But the question that I'd like to pose is this: in what kind of world would we actually find ourselves if everyone just assumed the mantle of judge, jury, and executioner as soon as they fear that someone in their mind might commit a crime? Just imagine how many men would die in this world that Matt wants, just because women were scared of them while walking home at night. Is this world a rational one? No. It would be anarchy. I also kind of just feel it necessary, now that we're talking about it, that I point out that Neely, the homeless man in question, had done nothing at this point besides acting out by complaining about the fact that he was hungry in an aggressive manner by, for example, throwing his jacket on the floor. His crime was being hungry and talking about it too loudly. His punishment for such an outrageous offense was the death penalty without a trial. According to Matt, this is not only totally acceptable, but also a good deed done by a, quote-unquote, as he says, good Samaritan.
Maybe they'll be able to intervene before anyone is seriously hurt or killed. Instead of that, a few passengers stepped up to do what was necessary. At least 3 good Samaritans restrained Neely. A white man and a former Marine had Neely in a chokehold. Another, a black man, was holding down his arms. They held him down for several minutes. And they weren't going to do that and then just let him go. So they held on to him. Eventually, Neely lost consciousness and died.
But really, who is the criminal here? The homeless man, starving, or the Marine that killed him in cold blood? And is it rational to side with the murderer in this instant? I think not.
Maybe the only time in human history where I will say I will use the alternative pronoun, because it does seem as though you are a demon.
I now want to bring this back to empathy and rationality, and how acting with apathy can actually make an easy answer sound so much more attractive and thus also convincing than answers that introduce the often more logical and necessary nuance required to fully understand a problem. In this video, we can yet again see our old friend Dr. Jordan Peterson addressing his concerns with what he calls moralists or Deloitte-style moralists, and how, in his eyes, they are the ones responsible for the current economic difficulties that we face worldwide.
Have you all noticed that food has become much more expensive? That shelter has become much more expensive? That energy is more expensive? That many consumer goods are simply unavailable? Can you not see that this is going to get worse if the Deloitte-style moralists have their way? How much short-term pain are you going to be required to sustain? Decades worth? All your life and the life of your children? It's very likely for your own benefit. Remember that. And all this painful privation is not only not going to save the planet, it's going to make it far worse.
Watching this video for the first time, I found myself asking how any of this makes sense. I mean, how do you blame people who fight for social justice for a failure that is by definition economic and thus systemic in nature? But then I realized it's not supposed to make sense on its own. Rather, it only makes sense for someone that already believes that social justice is an evil that must be stopped. This is of course done by design, in order to capitalize off the disdain that they constantly create for the straw man of the left through their dishonest rhetoric. It's simply supposed to give those that hate the left already another reason as to why they are on the right to feel this way, even if the reason given is irrational once you think about it. It's a very easy answer to not only one but multiple complex questions. Why is X happening? Oh, it's because of the people I don't like, obviously. A not only more correct but also more rational answer would have to look into what happened in recent years that could have affected our economy, such as, I don't know, global pandemic. We should critically analyze the systems in place to understand how they failed us, so that we can then either iron out the flaws or even create an entirely new system altogether. So why does Peterson give this as an answer then?
Can you not see that this is going to get worse if the Deloitte-style moralists have their way? How much short-term pain are you going to be required to sustain?
Well, obviously a real answer would not only require more time to go into detail, but also the appropriate statistics and calculations for us to arrive at what we would probably call a somewhat satisfying conclusion. The unfortunate truth is, however, that most people, when confronted with this much information they usually don't give a damn about, they will tune out mentally. So, being, the social media sensation that he is, and fearing what every content creator basically fears is losing his viewers' attention, Peterson instead tells them what they want to hear, rather than the truth. He goes about this by not only reducing the concerns as the fault of a party that in reality really has nothing to do with them, but also creates a warped sense of rationality by being harsh in his condemnation. The idea that facts don't care about your feelings is on full display here in this obviously emotional argument. Because Peterson and others on the right accuse those fighting for social change as being over-emotional throughout their many videos, this in turn makes them appear as though they were acting with rationality without emotions clouding their judgment in their viewers' eyes. But as we can see, they are the ones using emotional leverage as a tool to reinforce your beliefs. In short, Peterson's answer is so satisfying to those on the right because it pins a problem onto the opposition as a scapegoat for anything that goes wrong in the world, in order to justify the constant demonization of them while maintaining the illusion that the feared others are the ones that are too emotional, while he is the voice of reason. And so the question that already haunts this entire damn video comes up again. Is it rational to pin the blame for a systemic failure on a group of people you don't agree with, without providing any evidence to support these claims, rather than the system that failed itself? I don't think so.
Senator, kids are going to kill themselves because of this law. Iowa children will die if this becomes law.
Next up is not so much a way that the right might trick you, but rather a look into how the politics the right pushes for affect people in the real world as we speak, to just, show you how your actions actually have consequences that you don't actually experience. We already discussed how gender-affirming care can save lives in this very video. Well, this very year, the year 2023 of our Lord, we passed 230 bills all across the US that are anti-LGBTQ in nature. That's more bills than there have been days so far. Let that sink in for a minute. These legislations range from the tame book bans, like the Nazis, to altogether banning access to gender-affirming care in states like Tennessee. Now, I know that most of you just shrugged hearing this, so allow me to explain the effect the latter has on your fellow Americans, on human beings. Imagine you always kind of hated your body, but then, thanks to a magical fairy, you now look exactly how you'd want to look. But then, the news reaches you that all these fairies are now being hunted down by the government and their progress is reversed. The following months is, of course, hell for you. Imagine watching as over the course of a few weeks, your body that you just learned to love was transforming into the opposite sex. I know this sounds absurd, but this absurdity is the reality for trans people in the states where HRT is now illegal. I want to reiterate, to really make this clear. They lived their entire lives hating their body and by extension themselves, you get that, and now they finally feel at home again, only for people that don't even want to do as much as try to understand how this feels to block access to what completed them as a person. Imagine being a man and having to watch as your muscles shrink, your voice shifting into a higher pitch, and your breasts growing, your face becoming more and more feminine with each day. Imagine being a woman and watching your muscle mass increase, noticing how your voice deepens and feeling your face as hair starts to grow on it. For most people, this would be a horror so out of this world it could only happen in a movie or a book. But for about 5% of all people living in Tennessee and other states that banned HRT, this horror is something they live with as we speak. And I ask you again, is it rational to support people that want to see other people go through this? I don't think so, and I hope you don't either.
To hide it. If you have any sort of bad opinions now, we can't have disagreements. That means you're a bad person.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a cartoon because most people don't actually behave like that in the real world.
In this video, I broke down how right-wing figureheads often trick their audience into perceiving them as rational. I hope this might have shifted your perspective to be a bit more critical of the media that you consume. That being said, there is something else I want to address, and that is the left as a whole, and some issues I have with it. Boy, I'm sure this is gonna go well. When I talk to centrists or even right-wingers, I often hear from them that they feel as though the left is too combative and too aggressive in the way they present their arguments. Now, this is a position I very much agree with, as unfortunate as it is to admit that. For the side of politics that prides itself on tolerance and inclusivity, we sure enjoy dunking on white boys that don't understand the idea of privilege for acting out of pocket. Something that is the opposite of inclusivity or tolerance in my personal opinion. I also understand why many of us are like this, especially if you are among those groups that the right targets to score brownie points from their audience. But understanding something and accepting something are two very different things. This is no excuse to walk the earth shitting on those you decided to brand as heretics while complaining that they treat you like shit. If you hope to see some real change in this world at any point whatsoever, you have to start waking up to the fact that no one wins a war. We make peace with our enemies and win them to our cause. This, of course, by no means is to be interpreted as me saying that you should just take their shitty attitude without fighting back, but rather as me saying don't instantly see the worst in people and try to be kind in your argumentation. Now, I also have a message to the right. I know that many of you are confused and probably even pissed when you get called a bigot by some liberal on Twitter, and I want to make light of that situation. Often those on the right claim that they don't hate certain demographics when they get called out on this. And to be charitable and fair, I'll pretend that this is always the case. The unfortunate truth is that even if you don't feel animosity towards these people yourself, the people that trick you into using their talking points often do. The laws they push for often put certain groups at a disadvantage, even if Ben Shapiro tells you that they don't. No one, and I just get this in through your head, no one would support a homophobe if they claim to be one out loud, but the fact is that they are, and you buying into their flaky way of creating seemingly rational arguments and then repeating it sound exactly like that. If you don't want to be called a bigot, don't say things bigots train you to say. It's that simple. I'm sorry if I'm being harsh. I'm trying to be nice this whole video, so just take this one. It's tough love. For example, if you find yourself saying that you don't mind gay people, but you feel that it's trendy nowadays to become, to be gay or become gay or whatever you want to say, this is an extremely bigoted thing to say. So let's go into why. If you look at the rate of left-handed people, we can observe that the rate went up when writing with your left hand was no longer considered to be satanic by conservatives. This is not only a trend we observe with left-handed people and gay people, but in general, groups that hide parts of their identity or personality in fear of social, ostracization, or however the fuck you say that word. So being gay is not so much a trend as it is just more accepted than it once was, and thus more gay people are honest about their sexuality. So yeah, it's bigoted to assume that someone would choose to be gay, when really they were always born that way. I know that the left can seem extremely overcorrective and even arrogant at times. I myself am definitely guilty of this here and there. Look at my fucking comment section. But for every radical man-hating feminist that we have 100 more that are reasonable, that will explain their views to you in a calm and articulate manner. To be honest with you, I'd rather have a radical and man-hating feminist, as I'm going to call them now, than literal neo-Nazis, as the worst my side has to offer. I'll leave it at that. I remember that when I was a right-winger, I always thought that I knew exactly what the left was about. But then, over the last few years, I've learned that this is all just something that people who are funded by big donors and people that are paid $50 million for 3 years of work, like Steven Crowder, are paid to tell me these lies in order to get me to side with them. And there's one thing both leftists and conservative can probably agree on. What's good for those with billions is never quite good for us that do the dirty work for them. So yeah, I've got one last question for you. If you've watched this far and haven't subscribed yet, is that a rational thing to do? I don't think so. With all that said, I hope this reaches the right eyes and ears. Anyways, till next time, much love, cheers, and subscribe. I want to be famous.